Welcome to Kingdom Commentaries, August 10th, 2008. Tonight we're going to talk about determinism. This subject is very important to Christians because it determines whether God just knows things ahead of time or actually declares things ahead of time. Speaking with us about this topic tonight is Monty Collier. Monty, welcome.
Hello, Roderick. How are you doing?
Good. Good to have you.
Good to be here.
All right. Well, some people may know you from your various YouTube episodes that you put out in the Monty Collier report. But go ahead and give us some more background about Monty Collier, if you would.
Yeah, like you said, my name is Monty Collier, and I became a Calvinist back in the late 1990s while I was attending college, and been studying ever since. And that's kind of a little attribute in Calvinism is you have to study quite a bit, and it's a lifelong process. But I've preached in Baptist churches as well as Presbyterian churches, and currently I'm teaching elder at a small independent Reformed church in Northeast Tennessee, and so that's kind of where I'm at right now. And like you said, I put up a series of videos on YouTube, a little show that I have called the Monty Collier Report, and if you go to YouTube, you can search for that and usually find one of my episodes that'll lead you to my channel page.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll give a direct link on the website here as well. So we're going to talk about determinism, and you mentioned Calvinism. A lot of people, when they hear that word, especially those who have no have no background in that, a lot of times they'll run away screaming, "Oh no, Calvinism!" Well, determinism is not really an ism so much as it is just the straightforward biblical concept of God's character and nature. God just doesn't know things like some 900-line psychic. He actually has determined things, and we get that from Isaiah 46:10, where it actually says that God declares the end from the beginning, in the ancient times of things that are not yet done, saying, "My counsel shall stand, and I will do my pleasure." So, a lot of times we hear these non-Reformed or non-Calvinistic Christians that will say, well, Calvinism and that concept that God does all these things didn't happen until the late 1600s or 1500s. But what we want to establish here is determinism is the basic Christian principle and understanding of God's character. Could you fill us in some more on that, perhaps?
Just as we're throwing out terms, whenever you're talking to someone, you have to become familiar with their vocabulary. It's like any study. I use the term Calvinism a lot. I prefer to use the term Calvinism. Some people don't. It's not necessary. Some people just simply say biblical Christianity. That's fine too. But since I adhere strictly to the Reformation, and I want people to understand exactly where I'm coming from, and even still today, that may not be the case, because people have their own idea, like you said, what Calvinism may or may not be. I'll use that term. When we talk about God's eternal counsel, then some people call that simply predestination. I prefer to call it absolute predestination, the absolute predestination of all things. Some people call it biblical determinism. That's fine. But like you mentioned, you brought up Isaiah 46, verse 10. And you read the verse, and a very straightforward verse, very clear, simple proposition, easy to understand. Essentially, whatever happens is the result of God's determinate counsel. And you can see that repeated in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11. And then if you want to make a little syllogism to help you understand the implications of the verse, you might add a second premise to the proposition found in Isaiah. And let's just say Martin Luther's posting of the 95 Theses is something that happened. And when you combine those two premises together, you get the conclusion, which necessarily follows, that Luther's posting of the 95 Theses is the result of God's determinate counsel. And so that's what we're claiming. Things don't just happen. God knows what's going to happen because He has determined what is going to happen. And that's how God knows the future. He doesn't look into the future like a magician or a gypsy might look into a crystal ball. He doesn't predict the future like a weatherman might try to predict the weather. He knows what's going to happen because He has planned it. And that knowledge is immutable, and when you combine that with his omnipotence, then of course it will come to pass. And so this is what we mean when we talk about the absolute predestination of all things. But since we're talking definitions, let me give a basic definition of determinism, because like you mentioned, there's other kinds of determinism. Your basic definition of determinism is simply the belief that all events are the necessary results of previous causes. And so events are effects, and every effect logically presupposes a cause. And you have different types of schools of thought on determinism. You have physicalism, which humanists often hold to, although they seem to be getting away from that. But when we say biblical determinism, or the absolute predestination of God in all things, this is the belief that whatsoever comes to pass is the necessary result of God's eternal decree. And he brings these decrees to pass, as we might point to the Westminster Confession of Faith, by his works of creation and providence. So men and angels do not have a free will. They don't have a will that's free from God's determination. God alone is sovereign, and so God alone has free will. So it's important to note that man's will is not determined by nature. And by that we mean the physical universe, like physical causation, chemical causation. A lot of psychology, like B.F. Skinner, they advocate that, you can take a certain medicine, it'll change your behavior. That's why they're always prescribing something for people who are depressed. But this, like we said, presupposes a worldview of physicalism, an atheism. And Thomas Hobbes was teaching this, for example, back in the 17th century, and this is why the Westminster Assembly came up with Chapter 9 in their Confession on free will. And let me just quickly read that and let's see what you think about that. On Section 1 of the Confession, it says, God hath endued the will of man with natural liberty. Pay attention to that, natural liberty. That is neither forced nor by any absolute necessity of nature determined to good or evil. That's Chapter 9, Section 1. Notice it doesn't say that man is endowed with liberty from God. He has natural liberty, but his will is not free from God. This is important because this differentiates biblical determinism from other humanistic forms of determinism. And so we would quote Acts 17:28, that we live, move, and have our being in God. And if we were ever to become free from God in a metaphysical sense, in any metaphysical sense, we would cease to exist. So by definition, we cannot be free from God. Our will is contextualized, if you want to say it that way, in God. So thus it is determined by God. So I'm sure you're familiar with the Westminster Confession on that, since you're a Presbyterian.